So this is Andrew Williams Jr. with General Arnold, Gordon Bray, Michael Rendler. We're just talking about we just are going to begin to tell you that we're shifting from first Fridays to first Mondays. And General Bray, you can do a Hollywood do-over for just a few moments and give me a chance to reorganize myself, and we'll move forward from there, please.
Okay, I will, first of all, the reason why we're shifting from first Fridays to first Mondays is because on December 6th of this year, 2021, we will be celebrating the 13th Amendment. Many people get excited about the Juneteenth celebration. And while that is deservedly so, especially south of the Mason-Dixon line, the reality is that slavery did not end in America. It only ended in the Confederacy. Slavery ended with the passing of the 13th Amendment that was not ratified until December 6th, 1865, when Georgia became the 27th of 35 states, three-fifths of the United States, to sign the 13th Amendment. So on that day, the other 250,000+ slaves that were still resident in Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware were free. Because until that time, the North still had slaves, and folks forget that. The border states had slavery, by the way, slavery, and they were some of the more brutal places for slavery. But so because of that, on December 6th, under the leadership actually and the design of Dr. Carl Mack of the National Society of Black Engineers, we're going to try to make that a day of Black equity and equality and freedom, whereby we patronize the Black businesses around the country and even around the globe, so that we one, recognize that slavery did not end until that day across the United States. And then two, we start to reflect on the greatest expression of freedom, which is financial literacy and wealth building, because that's what really gets a person to the point whereby they can enjoy all of the freedoms of this country. And it is also that area, one of those 4 pillars of character development: health and wellness, science, technology, engineering, math, education, and then financial literacy and wealth building, that we really elevate and start to move our communities to a whole new level. And maybe next time we do get together, we can talk a little bit about economics. With that said, Andrew, thank you very much, and back to you.
Economics. Well, we can't leave it there. Please describe the definition of that word.
Well, you know that one of the other terms I introduced is called, U3D. Underserved, underrepresented, undervalued, and disenfranchised, U3D. That's a recognition that the world is browning. It's a recognition that the communities that we have are never solely one direction. They're never solely people that are of African descent. They're never solely those things. But the people in those communities at different levels, varying levels, still suffer in the same way. And you know, you think about a kid like an Eminem or so, if you told him at 12, 13 that he had white privilege, he'd never understand what the hell you're talking about. He couldn't do it. Similarly, you know, we talk about the NBA as a Black sport. It really is. At 90+%, we think it's Black folks. The reality is, if you watch the first 5 selections of the NBA draft, their white mothers stood up with them. Those kids are growing up with a different perspective. They have to be, because they're not going to grow up with the disdain for their mother. In fact, they're going to embrace themselves, and they'll be just like George Floyd. The last thing they will have to cross their mind is their mother's warmth and love. And so but the community from which we have derived, many of them are impacted by that recognition. So we learned from different places. I personally have learned that when I walk into a room sometimes, the perception of who I am, or even the perception of a Michael Jordan with his dollars, if you recognize him and his dollars and recognize him as Michael Jordan, but not as someone else, it changes the perception and the treatment. What they see is changed by what they know and or believe. And so you become elevated, separated in many cases from the prejudices that might otherwise be associated with you, and ultimately the treatment for the untrained mind of how you are handled. It's important for a person who understands economics so that it is not an abuse, nor does it become the abuse of a Black privilege. It becomes a recognition that you are being treated a certain way, so that you don't make the assumption of treatment, or worse, you don't make the assumption that the treatment you got is the treatment that all others get who look like you. It also makes you more conscious of lifting while climbing. Economics. Andrew?
Well, thank you very much. I certainly appreciate that. I do hope you do have a few more minutes. Michael, I do also hope you have a few more moments for 2 reasons. One, I do have to take issue with the statement that you made, General Bray, in response to a statement that I made during our last conversation. It was that I was reporting that earlier this year, the Howard University, in their role as leader of the Sustainable Development Goal Network, have produced a report indicating that in the United States, none of the 50 states are achieving even 50% of the targeted goals for the sustainable development, and that in each of those states, it was the indigenous, Latinx, and African Americans who actually were the ones that were most left behind. The title of that report is "The United States is Failing in its Delivery of the SDGs." Your response, I would have to say somewhat defensively, that the United States has not failed in its delivery. And I certainly do agree with you. My only point is that we have to do what's called a needs assessment and determine the existing facts so that we can then proceed. So it was actually in that context that I was introducing the report titled "The United States is Failing." And I agree with you that no, we have not failed. And I'm committed, along with Michael Rendler and the Encounter think tank team, to deliver real life solutions right here in the heart of Los Angeles, because it's my belief that we do, as Michael Jackson said, we have to heal Los Angeles. We have to heal ourselves, right? And then heal Los Angeles to heal the world. And so with Measure J, that is a distinct commitment on the part of the citizens of Los Angeles to address those issues. So Michael, it seems that General Bray has left, but again, I'm going to ask if you would be so kind as to share your thoughts on this earlier email that I sent to you addressing the factory of the future, if you were be so kind. So I know that's a imperfect segue, but here we are, Michael.
Yeah,
I'll
no, I think the email correspondence is really interesting because this factory of the future is exactly what Lacey in Los Angeles has set up, the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator. And so their premise is that the amount of innovation needed to do our net zero city is very, very robust. And to make sure that that alignment happens, we need to be able to consider what is called agile manufacturing. And so this is like a local sourced fabrication as needed delivery system. And so being able to build something like this, we've written a position paper, which I shared in the email chain, called Smart Citizen. It's predicated on, rather than the Autodesk narrative, the Siemens narrative, which is called Total Integrated Automation. And what that asks for is what I was talking to General Bray earlier about, is a simulation environment for predictive performance, so that we then would be able to direct digital workflow into this factory of the future. So rather than us seeing manufacturing separate from engineering, separate from marketing, separate from communication, we see these as integrated processes. And these digital processes then can be embedded in skill sets at a level of competency across our 15 CTEs, career technical education pathways, so that regardless of where a student is starting high school, they have full opportunity in understanding what this comprehensive digital workflow looks like. And that digital workflow, as the images behind me with the E7 work products, is not just the simulation environment, but it's the analog environment, the products that we consume as well. And so this is a component of us kind of making a full circle model, or what General Bray called an all-in model. This idea of actually looking at the products. And so the products and the production of those products needed for us to be able to do agile manufacturing and closed loop systems, when it's localized, it's going to have the greatest ecological benefit. So these ideas are not unique ideas. This is how nature builds itself. This is what's called regionalism. We shouldn't be making things in China that we need to use in Los Angeles. We should be making the things we need to use in Los Angeles with a local workforce, local source process, with the least carbon footprint, not the greatest carbon footprint. So this is all part of us, as General Bray talked about earlier. This is all part of our regional environmental conversation. And where this is going to come online, specifically in Los Angeles, is work coming out of Chaos Studios in Leimert Park, where they're looking at next generation last mile circulation and transportation systems that can be locally fabricated to show cultural innovation at the local level. And this gets into this whole idea of what the last mile transportation network could be in terms of a regional process. So these are things that we're working on with our Smart Citizen paper with Brad Carson and our reentry population, and this last mile narrative in Leimert Park following the Crenshaw metro system that's going to have a portal in Leimert Park. So we're looking at how culturally we can use this factory of the future, bring this factory of the future online as part of, we call it an innovation lab. He may call it the factory of the future, but we'd see that as something integral in our delivery model of VCAP, virtual community action planning.
Well, I'm going to go back to Destination Crenshaw if you have time. But in the meantime, I'd like to shift to Kansas City, Missouri, because as I understand it, it is with aSTEAMvillage.org and William Wells that the city of Kansas has endeavored upon what you may call, I guess, a best case example of what it is you mean. But could you explain to us a little bit more about aSTEAMvillage and the work that they've been doing and how that impacts the work that you're discussing with HUD, et cetera, that may be replicable here in Los Angeles?
Yeah, sure. So William Wells and I, we've been working together pretty much as long as General Bray and I, 6 years. And our intention is to do inclusion. So this started with an initiative in Kansas City called the Choice Neighborhood Initiative. The Choice Neighborhood Initiative was a series of projects that are going on in a specific area of Kansas City. I went back there to start to discuss how the interagency, interdepartmental conversation could activate through a virtual space like VCAP or virtual community action planning. And through the work of William Wells, we're able to attend several of the discussions about this Choice Neighborhood Initiative. In that effort, we saw that it wouldn't be just the design process, but it would be the design, build, and operate closed loop system that would create a genuine inclusion model. And over time, there's been other initiatives that have happened. So when E7 finished the simulation solution for the Metro Crenshaw project, 96 million square feet of simulation we did with the students, that was done by E7, but the hard level engineering project was done by actually an engineering firm out of Kansas City, stationed in Kansas City, HNTB. And so when HNTB saw the work that we were doing in Los Angeles, they're active in Kansas City. They were working with William Wells, their IT director. We had some conversation about the new, they call it a streetcar system in Kansas City. So they wanted to do a simulation of the streetcar system and a what if scenario if that streetcar system was to come to their historical jazz district, 18th and Vine. And so this area of 18th and Vine, similar to Leimert Park, had an opportunity to do a study. And so we became collaborative in how to show young youth how to use these tools, use these processes to actually be able to empower their neighborhoods through virtualization and simulation. So William has his students working with the FIRST Robotics. He's been working with NASB, General Bray referenced NASB, National Society of Black Engineers, and he's been very active with BDPA, Black Data Processors Association. So those strategic partners we had meetings with to look at the nexus, the interface between computer science, architecture, our environment with engineering. And it's in that nexus space that we see all this opportunity. So by showing a group of students, William has titled the Red Tails, and working with the council district, we were able to show that the existing inventory of the 18th and Vine has great potential. We don't need to clear cut, as they would say in forestry. We actually have existing buildings that we can create an inventory and an assessment. And then by doing that, then the students then said, what if scenario play? And then they were able to show not only the city council member, but the mayor as well, and the congressman, how using these kinds of geospatial tools creates what Obama called an open data model. And what Obama wanted to have happen was bringing research down to the middle school. So by creating a hybrid workspace between university students, high school students, and middle school students, we were able to create a virtual learning community using a VCAP process. And what the media then plugged into was, oh, now we can see that the youth need to be at the table for all land use development concepts. And that when we presented the work from the students, actually the students presented the work, the youth, the city council member and the mayor realized the level of sophistication that the students were able to deliver back to the city council members, so that the city council member and the mayor would raise the bar what the expectations were of the municipality. Because at the beginning of the project, working with the University of Missouri, Kansas City, we were requesting a certain level of data so that we could put the model together, similarly to how we put the model together with HNTV and the Crenshaw corridor. What became clear quickly is they didn't have the data in an open data platform like Los Angeles has. And so we used Los Angeles Open Data Platform as a launch point to start a discussion with Kansas City, how this is the next frontier of what community engagement could look like. And so building that model, building that simulation, now the city council has allocated a certain resource directly to aSTEAMvillage to start to look at putting in the necessary digital infrastructure so that all of those existing buildings would then be on a fiber backbone and be able to have a telecommunication infrastructure, so that then they would be able to start to talk about digital fabrication. This as opposed to a one-off development that they were thinking about as an innovation lab. So what they realized is the point of departure is a base map. The point of departure is a fabric that then gets augmented and gets managed as we move forward with the evolution of the 18th and Vine area. This now has been discussed with Congressman Cleaver, and Congressman Cleaver is the chair of the Black Caucus for Congress. And he is very in tune and will be speaking on September 16th to a working group workshop that's going to be held with the city council, with the mayor, and how this comprehensive model that General Bray and I just kind of outlined is coming online. And we're really hopeful through the work now with the City of Los Angeles Housing Authority and the mayor's office through the CDLA project, Careers for Design Los Angeles, Careers by Design Los Angeles, CDLA, that this then becomes an empowerment mechanism, not only for Destination Crenshaw, but for the Slauson Corridor, for the Watts Rising, for the Choice Neighborhood in Watts, for a multitude of projects that are going on across the South Los Angeles area, and a level of sophistication associated with that. So we're leveraging the work out of Kansas City back into Los Angeles through the Youth Employment Project. So the mayor's office has 10,000 youth they want to employ. We're coordinating how to use the digital literacy, the pay to learn model as a base map methodology to actually get this data into the narrative within the neighborhood councils.
So I'm I'm going to share my screen briefly with the Destination Crenshaw website. It's destinationcrenshaw.la for those in our audience that have an interest in it. However, I was very intrigued, Michael, the first time I came here and looked at it. As I was scrolling down the page, I was pleased to see this short video. So hopefully you'll have an opportunity to join with me in watching this very short video about Destination Crenshaw and allow our audience around the world to know what to expect. As I understand it, however, it's going to be November of 2022 when the Crenshaw LAX transit line is officially open. But for those that don't know, for the first time ever, the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transit Authority will have a subway that introduces those people, millions of people arriving in Los Angeles, to first experience the community that has so far been left out of the consideration. And that is an area that's now called South Los Angeles, but at one time it was more well known as South Central Los Angeles. There is a history to that naming as well. You may recall that during the period of time that was discussed in our earlier broadcast, dealing with Freeway Rick and the crack epidemic, not just throughout the world, but in particular throughout the pipeline here in Los Angeles, that saw devastation of entire cities, that also saw in 1992 with the eruption of the Rodney King riots, a world's lens on the inequalities that still existed in Los Angeles over 20 years after the Los Angeles, or I should say the Watts riots occurred. So that is where physically the location is of 5 Points Youth Foundation, of which I'm in president. And we actually launched there in 2012, 20 years after the 1992 civil unrest, primarily because we felt that there needed to be a place to show the community that we had hope and that we do have a commitment to the future. And I do want to thank Pando Populous, along with the Los Angeles Trade Technical College, and Very Nice for conducting back in 2017 a vision of redesigning death alleys. Because in addition to the economic deprivation, this was also the area that had the highest incidence of gang deaths in Los Angeles County that unfortunately has not changed. And now in 2021, with the recent outbreak of violence, post-pandemic and during the pandemic, and the decision that there would be an investigation into the pipeline of arms into our community, these are all of the effects and activities that are happening all around us that we still have a thriving community that has to survive, must deal with, and we must repurpose. Because our built environment has over 95%, as I understand it, of the impact on the lives of the people involved. So what we have now is the opportunity for us to have our youth to repurpose that vision. Let me share this video with you, if I may. And Michael, this also speaks to the digital divide that we were talking about earlier. Now, I'm in an area in Los Angeles where supposedly we have 5G connectivity, but again, I'm in South Los Angeles. So you can imagine with our kids returning back to school now, that they're going to have to deal with their built environment of the delivery of broadband connection throughout our area in order to be able to fully participate with education. But this is just an example of the challenges that we are facing but must overcome during our operation. Close it. All right. So Michael, I'm gonna give up on having tried to show this right now, but I will say the Destination Crenshaw .LA is a source of this video and also a source of information about the history of the Crenshaw area, and also the future that's being delivered and developed. But I do want to also refer to something that General Bray mentioned earlier, the 360 Cradle to Careers.org. As I understand it, that's being championed by Faith Linton and Gerald Bennett. Could you be so kind as to tell us a little bit about how that might relate to this discussion, particularly when we're talking about the Housing and Urban Development Department, and they deal with most of our housing for our socially disadvantaged people in the United States. But more importantly, Michael, as far as I'm concerned, HUD is also our representative with the United Nations and their UN Habitat Project, and their new urban agenda provides a blueprint for ways that we can work together throughout the world to improve our habitats. So what are your thoughts on that, Michael, as I wrestle with technology here?
Well, first, we all have our challenges. So I got my trash truck in the alley while we're having the meeting. So of course, the 360 project and the concepts around the 360 project is to do something called a collective impact model. And a collective impact model is the premise that there are certain I'll call them toxicities that are within our solutions. And in those toxicities, you need multiple events to happen simultaneously. And to get all of those cylinders to file in synchronous order, you need to have a backbone organization. And the backbone organization needs to have an understanding of cross-checking and evaluating the necessary entities, which we call subject matter experts, in building out this model. So the model has been fairly flushed out. General Bray referred to Excite and Engage. And then that is an orientation and an awareness that this is happening. And that is identified, or excuse me, targeted towards a youth stream. And then there's an Elevate component. And the Elevate component is everything's not for everybody. And so through the interface and through the process, we then can identify specific characters and what their ambition is, and bring the whole of community model to those individuals interested in that Elevate narrative. And in that elevation, we then move into what we call phase 2. And phase 2 is community capacity building. So HUD has a project they call Community Campus and Community Compass. And that program is looking at how you build capacity within a community. And this idea of us being able to build capacity has to do with a collective impact. So us being able to know that all the components are assembled and be able to be delivered on time, on schedule, if you will, is where the backbone organization will fall. So as we want to activate our opportunity zones, we need to have a backbone organization that has a whole of community approach, so that as we bring the service providers in to actually help activate our subject matter experts to activate those projects, which we call capital construction projects, we've done what we'll call metaphorically the soils work. So the soil has been prepared, and then when those capital construction projects actually get activated, we have an aware and responsive community that then can not only participate in design process, but also would be the contracting entities to deliver the service. And so having the backbone organization called 360 Cradle to Career, we have a national network of major cities that then understand this whole of community approach, and that we can then conduct best practice. So the thinking is, as we do work in Los Angeles, it may not be exactly the same way they do it in Richmond, Virginia. It may not be the way they do it in Cary, Indiana, but the idea of going from excite and engage, elevate, community capacity building, capital construction projects, we then would be able to have a unified narrative of best practice using an organization like 360 Cradle to Career, which is a backbone organization for a collective impact model. And that collective impact model comes out of Stanford University. And it's to look at, large systemic issues like first five education, like things where we have a literacy problem of people in the 5th grade reading at a 2nd grade level, and it's systemic. So how do you address that? So you put a program like an aSTEAMvillage in, and then you do these enrichments, and out of those enrichments, then they start to realize what General Bray was talking about, what their full potential is. And then they start to realize, okay, this is my direction, this is my opportunity. And then we have the backbone organization so that when it moves up to doing the improvement projects, we put together the paperwork and the model in something called the Envision Centers. And so the Envision Centers were, how do we bring all of this so there's a transparency for diversity, equity, and inclusion? And those white papers that we wrote as 360 Cradle to Career in 2017, 2018 became legitimized, if you will, in 2017 through this Envision Center. And aSTEAMvillage in Kansas City is the Envision Center for the city of Kansas City, Missouri, and is the Envision Center for the city of Kansas City, Kansas. And so that creates a direct narrative with the city hall, with the public housing authority, and with the nonprofit. So now you have a whole of community approach through public housing directly connected to HUD so that we can do this 360 Cradles to Career model. I hope that explained it.
Yes, that thoroughly explained it. However, there are a few other issues I like to bring up that you touched on. One, this whole community approach is very relevant to me. It's in fact the Federal Emergency Management Association whole community approach that had a workshop in Compton, California back in 2011. And that's where I was first introduced to the concept that we can leave no one behind. Because the idea was that we were supposed to, from a whole community approach aspect, deliver solutions to even those with unmet needs. So that's critically relevant to us now, Michael. And we have kind of not spoken about the elephant in the room. And that elephant in the room is the disaster that began back on March 16th of 2019 called COVID-19 that is still continuing now, but the after effects have shown the glaring disparities that we're faced with here in our United States and our entire ecosystem. So it seems that this effort that we're involved with now can have implications not just here locally in Los Angeles, but around the world. In particular, oops. In particular, because what we are working through is something called the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction. That's the companion. That's the companion operation, if you would, that was launched at the same time as the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. So the idea is that in addition to having national adaptation plans for disaster recovery, that there's a need for us to engage the local community. So Michael, I hope what I hear you saying is that, for example, with the Watch Rising project, we're now at the local level where we can have communities to address these issues that can have an effect throughout, let's say, the neighborhood council districts, and then countywide, statewide, and nationally, and internationally. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think the environmental umbrella is the term sustainability, and inside of the term sustainability is resilience. So resilience is actually a subset, if you will, of sustainability. And so if you look at the SDGs, then you start to realize that at its core, that's an information technology. And so that information technology, what you talked about earlier, the baselining of the environment fits to the carbon narrative. So as we decarbonize and recognize biodiversity, then we can talk about adding 1 million people into the basin. And when we start to think about putting 1 million people into the basin, we have to get the 10 million people already in the basin to understand how the whole thing operates. So if you want someone to be included in a conversation, there's a commitment of education and awareness that needs to be brought into that community. And we believe that that's through this virtualization effort called VCAP, Virtual Community Action Planning, that through the neighborhood councils and through their ancillary organizations within the county, we then can have a model that would then be able to underpin the cross-pollination within our public agencies necessary to address Judge Carter's homeless order. So without having that infrastructure, which I call an information technology, we're not going to have a legitimate homeless narrative or unhoused narrative. And so one of the things we're trying to do is to say, this is an extension of our environmental justice, social justice initiative. And so the Watts Rising project brings the state level perception into how do you actually transform, if you will, a community using this as a narrative. And so, yes, we feel really very confident that by getting VCAP, Virtual Community Action Planning, as a platform of information technology underpinning decision-making that then affects the cross-pollination necessary to do decarbonization and carbon zero goals, we will then have a unification between the local level, the smallest order of government being the neighborhood council, up to the council districts, up to the city government, into the county, up to the state level, the assembly and the Senate, to then unify all of these environmental assembly bills and Senate bills that all have an engagement component associated with their distribution of resource. So that then becomes an engine, if you will, of transforming, or what you like to call restoration. So rather than sustainable, we're talking about restorative. And now what we do is we say, well, we need to fix all of this. It's not just we need to maintain it, we need to actually repair it. And so in that repair narrative, this is where General Bray is talking about some of our systemic racism perceptions. And that becomes our consciousness, our ability to solve problems. So yeah, we feel really confidently that this has all been discussed over the last 5-6 years, and that there's just a tremendous opportunity in innovation for actually being able to house the 100,000 unhoused people within Los Angeles, how to make this environment net zero. And this is a lot of the work that E7 has been involved with and presented over the last couple of years, how these simulation technologies then can allow us to do the what if scenarios.
Well, thank you. In the chat, I put a link. It's only 2 minutes long, so please indulge me. But we're having these conversations about sustainable development goals, and there are people that don't know what that means. I'll tell you quite frankly that around the world in 2000, when Kofi Annan as General Secretary announced the Millennium Development Goals, all the countries, or most of the countries that were members of the United Nations, they began at that point to make the Millennium Development Goals the centerpiece of what they were attempting to do for the benefit of the members of their countries. Although it was first seen as a fallback. You might recall back in 1999, the world had come together in the Durban Conference in South Africa to address debt relief for particularly African countries, but the United States and Israel vetoed that. So technically the United Nations Millennium Development Goals is the world's response to us all working together to deliver solutions to that. But again, there were 8 goals, and it was in 2009 when they realized that they were not anywhere near accomplishing those objectives. They developed, Michael, what's called the Big Push. And this was announced in 2009. I had the privilege of being on the negotiating team that successfully got the presidency of Senegal to provide sponsorship for the Millennium Development Goals Awards that launched a Big Push. So my own commitment preceded the Sustainable Development Goals, but I was there through this transition. But I do know for a fact that there aren't just 17 Sustainable Development Goals. There are actually 169 targets. And the idea is to move this from aspirational to functional. And so I'll briefly share with you these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And then I'd really like to kind of delve into what that means for us here in the United States, because we're not immune from the impacts of the Sustainable Development Goals on our people, nor are we immune to the need for us to be the ones to make the commitment to do something about it. So briefly, if I can get the right screen to show, it says Sustainable Development Goals, yes. And this is only a 2-minute event, but it's done with a hip hop flavor. And that's gonna bring us back around again to what we're trying to get done right here in Los Angeles. I see everything on here except what I'm looking for. So I'm gonna stop again and start. Okay, I'm in the right place there. And now I need to be on the right place over here. Oh, Michael, I lost you in my screen. So let me see if I can share. Here we go. The United Nations.
I can't hear it, Andrew.
Oh,
If I'm supposed to hear it.
okay, thanks. Let me make
before you
it
share it. Yeah, no problem.
Okay. Oops. All right, I'm gonna do it one more time and push the right buttons. That's the button, and here's the button.
This is an organization with goals of peace and sustainable development around the world. Their mission is huge, but we're breaking it down in 2 minutes.
Oops.
The United Nations is an organization with goals of peace and sustainable development around the world. Their mission is huge, but we're breaking it down in 2 minutes. 17 sustainable development goals. Let's get to them, cause the more you know. Look, in some corners of the world today, people are living on $1 a day. Hey, that's not how it ought to be. So go 1, eliminate poverty, and go 2, root out hunger across the globe. There's 800 million people hungry if you wanna know. Number 3 is health and well-being, and getting people the health care that they needing. Learning in school or the harder go for. Education opens up minds and doors. Goal number 5 is empower girls and women so they can have the same rights that men are given. Number 6, people need water that's clean. Poor sanitation can spread disease. Carbon-free energy is goal number 7. And how to achieve it is a question that's pressing. But if we put our minds together and work hard, we can find a solution, I'm guessing. 17 sustainable development goals to improve life all around the globe. Protecting human health and the environment. Whatever bed we make, we gon' have to lie in it. 17 sustainable development goals to improve life all around the globe. Protecting human health and the environment. Whatever bed we make, we gon' have to lie in it. Now imagine that you work all day for no pay. Economic growth and decent work is goal 8. Goal number 9 is to foster innovation in infrastructure and industrialization. Goal number 10, inequality reduction. 11 is sustainable city construction. 12, well, that's sustainable consumption. So what we use matches up with production. Goal 13 calls for urgent action to combat climate change, cause we know what's happening. 14, protect life under seas. 15, protect life on land. Goal 16 is for peace and justice. All over the planet, they're in high demand. And the final goal, number 17, is the critical factor, the heart of the machine. It's the strength in the way we achieve these goals of sustainable development around the globe. Yo, 17 sustainable development goals to improve life all around the globe. Protecting human health and the environment. Whatever bed we make, we gon' have to lie in it. 17 sustainable development goals to improve life all around the globe. Protecting human health and the environment. Whatever bed we make, we gon' have to lie in it.
Okay, thank you so much for your tolerance here, Michael. Again, I'm sharing this to the Encounter Think Tank page on Facebook. So, you know, this is relevant. We were talking earlier about Measure J. I do want to talk about too, biodiversity and the fact that the state of California has put biodiversity and its oceans at the core of its forward-looking investments in our future. So would you speak about how that might relate to what we're talking about, if you have time?
Yeah.
I see.
I mean, I think that the ocean concept is really in Los Angeles is the Measure W discussion.
Yes.
And so the Measure W for listeners is the idea that 1 billion gallons of rainwater that hits the basin ends up in the ocean. And that's really a poor use of all of that if our sustainability goal by 2035 is to have a closed loop system. And right now, 70% of the water is brought into Los Angeles. So doing that, we have something called Measure W. And Measure W is a sales tax that's going to fund about $250 million a year ad infinitum into the future. And I think most people that are following the news know that we lost 25 million gallons of sewage into the ocean last week because the Hyperion plant didn't operate correctly. And that idea of separating water from energy is kind of a little bit of a misnomer. And so I give you this background because the ocean and the ocean narrative and the LA River and the Bologna Creek, the two exits, if you will, of our flood system or our stormwater system have been really, really seriously compromised. And that includes all of our aquifers. And so the aquifer, and I did a talk, there's Proposition 1, which is a state initiative to get the public narrative about water in the same way we're trying to have a public narrative about SDGs about water. I did a talk about 2 weeks ago where I did a research project showing that some of our indigenous culture actually understood water management much better than we understand it in our contemporary way, and that in 1911, the United States Department of Agriculture looked at Los Angeles and had a lot of agriculture in the basin, and all that agriculture was not using water from the Colorado River. It was using natural systems of pumping water out of the aquifers. And so they were actually flooding the orchards and flooding the crops as a methodology of watering. And all that water then just went back into the aquifers. So there was a natural system that's existed in Los Angeles for a long time. Watts has several artesian wells that actually pump water out, but over time, people haven't paid attention to, what happens to the storm water now that we have a transportation network. And if you start reading the environmental reports that come in for, that the Army Corps of Engineers has prepared for the LA River, you start to realize that there's a lot of metals now, there's a lot of lead, there's a lot of materials that we really don't want to have in the ocean. And so what we need to do is we need to recharge the aquifers locally. And that is a little bit in conflict with some of the public municipality agendas of pumping the water to a Hyperion plant and recirculating the water as a purple pipe system back into Los Angeles. So this network of water management is connected to your Death Alley conversation, because there was a whole big project called Green Alleys that was done. And that Green Alley project was to activate these kind of really discarded spaces across Los Angeles, these alleys through South Los Angeles. And that Green Alley project was then tied to what were called green streets. And the green streets were to actually talk about how the tree canopy and the water hydration model would create that green canopy. Subsequently, we now have funding from the California Conservation Corps to do pilot work in Santa Monica called living streets. So now we've moved from green streets to living streets, and this is because Heal the Bay filed a lawsuit against Santa Monica and the city of Los Angeles for the pollution that was going into the ocean. And so this idea of polluting the ocean through our stormwater system in Los Angeles just reinforced what General Bray and I were talking about earlier. It's an interconnected, interdependent system. And that's how nature operates. And so having a clear understanding about the Los Angeles River, the capacity of the Los Angeles River as a stormwater mitigation measure that's actually envisioned as a recreational center or a recreational hub or a recreational spine. And all of that then has to get tied back to how is that water treated? How is that water put back into the aquifers? Where are the recharging stations? What does the gray water system look like? And those gray water systems are being investigated through a big laboratory that's part of the LACY project, Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator. And so we have done work to try to get the gray water, the living building, the stormwater systems, all better understood with this Watts Rising project, TCC grant in Watts. So there's a direct corollary between our wastewater management, our stormwater management, and our estuary in Bologna Creek, and how that is a natural preserve and bird sanctuary, which leads up to your biodiversity model. So there's a lot of things going on that tie the state, the Santa Monica Mountains, the National Park Service, the USGS. So all of these agencies now have interdependency characteristics to try to get the basin, the Los Angeles basin, as a operating, healthy, sustainable space. And I think that this is an awareness project as much as anything else with our population in Los Angeles.
Well, as I'm speaking to you from the home of the Tongva people and the indigenous people that are, as you might now know, still fighting across the country to protect our waterways, I'm going to wind up this conversation with a thanks to our indigenous peoples for providing us the guidance that are thousands of years old, that are in fact ones that reflect the relationship between man and nature and vice versa. So I do want to thank you so very much, Michael, for today. And I'll be sharing this with you via email with the link to this day's conversation, as well as to the previous editions that we have. So we'll be able to share this amongst our team.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Andrew, for all your hard work.
Thank you. And I'm going to end with a thanks to the Ed Fu Foundation, who themselves are committed to the indigenous communities, as well as the Revelation Network, TRN.TV, and of course, 5 Points Youth Foundation, Global Business Incubation, the Encounter Think Tank, and the list goes on. With that, have a fantastic day.
Thank you.